Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll let folks join the room. We're happy to have you all here today. During today's webinar, we'll be discussing environmental considerations for nearshore ecosystems from cable landfall, navigation, and port development for offshore wind energy. Today's webinar is the fourth and final webinar of this year's series that's hosted by the SEER project. My name is Mark Severy. I'm a researcher at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The agenda is to have a brief introduction to our project, and then we'll really kick into the core of the content and have our three presentations. That'll take roughly the first half of the hour. Within the second half, we'll have a moderated panel discussion and also have plenty of time for audience questions. If you do have questions, please enter those into the chat, and we'll do our best to address all of them during the panel discussion. So before diving into the topics today, I'd like to allow Joy Page from the Department of Energy to provide a brief opening.
Thank you, Mark. And welcome everyone. Once again, my name is Joy Page, and I manage the environmental portfolio at DOE's Wind Energy Technology Office. And I'm really excited about this last SEER webinar in our series. And I think many of you have heard me say before that SEER is one of our most valuable investments offshore. And through SEER, we're supporting research syntheses, project tracking databases, and helpful webinars like this one. And if you want to learn more, Mark will talk about it, but check out our SEER website on TFIS. And you're always welcome to reach out to me if there's a clear gap that you need when it comes to information sharing. This webinar is exciting because it's a little different than the webinars to date. We've really focused on environmental considerations far offshore where the wind turbines are being developed. And this one, it allows us to focus on some of the environmental concerns more near shore. And so we're trying to really round out our considerations when we think of offshore wind development. And I want to thank again to the NREL and PNNL team. It's been such a great partnership. You've done such a great job with this webinar series and the incredible speakers you brought here today. So thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Joy. So a little bit more background on the SEER project is, as Joy said, we're working to synthesize and disseminate the current state of knowledge around offshore wind energy and environmental effects. This project is led collaboratively by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And the outputs of this project are posted on that website that you'll find in the chat. We have research briefs covering a wide range of topics. We have this webinar series that has the recordings and more information online about that. And we also publish tools such as databases highlighting what are the research recommendations and knowledge gaps on the Atlantic coast and on the Pacific coast. We're excited to work on this project collaboratively and share this information with you all. So these are those three types of products that I mentioned, and here's a link for where you can find more information. With that brief opening, we can jump into the core topic for today, which is around those nearshore ecosystem considerations from offshore wind. And our first speaker will be Shane Phillips. Shane will be providing a background about what physical infrastructure is required for offshore wind at ports and cable landfalls to support offshore wind energy development. This should give us the context to understand what environmental considerations there may be. Shane is a senior civil and coastal engineer and Pacific Northwest Business Unit lead for Moffitt & Nichol, based in the Seattle office. He has 30 years of consulting experience with planning, permitting, and engineering design of ports, harbors, and waterways throughout the United States and internationally. A specialty within his ports and harbor experience has been focused on the planning and design of port infrastructure to support offshore wind renewables offshore renewables on the US West Coast. He co-authored the first West Coast port infrastructure assessment for BOEM in 2015 and conducted subsequent assessments in California, Oregon, and Washington. Welcome, Shane, and happy to let you share your screen with your presentation.
Thanks, Mark. And if you can confirm, you can see my screen.
It looks great.
Awesome. All right. So I'll be providing a very brief overview of infrastructure and construction relative to ports, navigation, and export cable landfall portions of an offshore wind farm. It's intended to be both a mixture of fixed and floating, because we have a little bit different technologies, of course, on the East Coast and West Coast. And just provide kind of an overview for perspective that the subsequent speakers are going to be talking about in a little bit more detail. All right, so many of you already may know about the size of these things. They're very large. This is courtesy of Ørsted, a graphic that they have that shows, these are very large wind turbine devices and infrastructure, and getting much bigger and continuing to grow bigger over time, not only in the past and present, but into the future. So this shows the progression up to a 12 megawatt. And I always like to show this graphic because it kind of gives some nice perspective. A blade at this size turbine is, around 350 feet. And there in the graphic shows, from the home plate to outfield in a Major League Baseball stadium, the scale of what we're dealing with. And in the industry, looking at anywhere from 20 to 25 megawatt, potentially looking out into the future. So what does that mean? It means that this is a marine transportation dependent industry, both based on a combination of the size of the components, but also location of the projects being offshore. So therefore, ports, harbors, and navigation channels are an important element in order to deliver this type of industry and infrastructure. Again, it's trending larger, so a term being used throughout the industry is future proofing, based on size, what those future needs are. They may not be defined yet, but trying to incorporate that into project developments and infrastructure. And that relates to purpose and need. The purpose and need might not be just exactly what you know today, but what you're anticipating for the future. So getting a little bit into the port classifications, again, this is a bit, hopefully a little bit generic to both, but on the left is more of a manufacturing type port where the components are going to be manufactured. In the middle is a staging and integration or marshaling port, depending on whether it's floating or fixed. Down below is a construction support facility. This would be where maybe the cable is stored, or chain or anchors or other elements for the construction. And that would be staged and then taken out for installation. And then over on the far right is an example of operations and maintenance once the facility's up and going. So many of these have similar types of port infrastructure needs, although varying degrees of size, capacity of structures, channel depths, things like that. So this is a more of a generic kind of schematic of a harbor, protected harbor. Protected harbors are an important part of the staging for construction for both types of offshore wind facilities. And so what this shows here is that oftentimes you may have, you're going to have a navigation channel. It may be a federal channel, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or other. It may be deep draft. It may be a medium draft or a shallower draft, depending on the types of vessels and what the needs are. And so associated with that would be maintenance dredging. There may need to be localized modifications to a channel, potentially for a specific project, or maybe in the future there's changes of uses, different types of vessels coming in. For floating, you've got a dead ship tow type vessel being brought through the channel that's a little different than in the past. There may need to be wet storage for floating. So that's additional dredging needs off channel, so that doesn't have any effect on the ongoing navigation. And then, of course, you got the berth and wharf, so you could have dredging there to get from the channel to to the actual wharf structure, pile supported type structures, bulkhead, seawalls. So the typical kind of port infrastructure, but especially for those port types that I showed more on kind of the left and upper part of the screen, these may be purpose built. They may not exist currently, so they may need to be built from scratch and have that future proofing consideration. So getting a little bit more on the construction side. So here, an example of a major terminal construction. There's a couple things going on here. In the near shore for the wharf, you've got pile driving. In the offshore there, you've got dredging, and that could be in a very small area. It could be a more comprehensive area. Slope rock armoring. Then you have dredge material placement of what kind of material are you dealing with? Does it go to open water disposal? Does it need to go upland? Maybe there's a beneficial reuse opportunity as well. And then, considerations you'll hear more from the other speakers, marine mammal, fisheries protection, aquatic habitats, water quality, contaminated sediment, dredge material management will be an important part. But then you have the land side as well. That includes getting, even though it's marine transportation dependent, there's likely going to need to be access roads coming in. All new utilities is a possibility. There's a trend towards electrification, greenhouse gas reduction. So there may need to be an upgrade of what kind of power is brought in. Maybe soft soils on the waterfront. You often encounter some soft soils. These are heavy bearing capacity requirements for these specialty components. So there may need to be soil improvement work, site grading, shore protection. And then of course, there may be some buildings on site too, especially for manufacturing or other kind of specialty needs. So there's a whole host of things here as well for considerations in that. Stormwater is a big one because these are very large sites. And oftentimes with some sort of a gravel finish is preferable. So had stormwater treatment, collection. And then there's visual and noise considerations too around the perimeter of the project. So then bringing us to the export cable landfall infrastructure. So these are two graphics here, one showing floating and one showing fixed, but you got the offshore wind turbines at the wind farm. You may have some sort of substation offshore. Then you have the export cable coming to the near shore, and some sort of transition infrastructure, a transition vault or something that then connects into a substation. And then that goes into some sort of existing electrical infrastructure. So buried cable, there could be scour protection associated with that in certain areas. And so you're working on the nearshore areas for this installation. This is just another graphic showing something similar, but it kind of points to a few other elements that it may not just need to come to shore along the Gulf or the ocean, but there may be interior waterways, bays, estuaries, navigation channels to then be able to actually connect into the grid. And so that's what this is demonstrating in the middle there, that you may have to deal with the navigation channel as well. So there's hazards for consideration of siting the infrastructure, whether it be shoreline change, where that export cable comes to shore, flooding considerations for the infrastructure that's up on land, tsunami, ocean sand waves is another consideration, or channel migration in the bay and sea level rise. Other things are anchoring vessels. There's geologic hazards, and then constructability, the sea state for the waves during construction for that offshore equipment. So it may end up being a seasonal construction window. And then there's also separation distances between these different cables if there's multiple cables coming in, and then minimum cover requirements and scour protection needs in certain areas. So this is just kind of a question that I've heard from some folks. Is this common practice to do something like this? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of industries that end up having to bring cables to shore. The telecommunications fiber optic is one that's done this for quite a long time to interconnect the world. And so some of the similar technologies are used for that. This comes from the submarine cable map that you can go on and take a look at where those come to shore and how we're interconnected. But yeah, kind of a similar type of approach for for some of the export cables. So coming back to this graphic and the installation, there's a variety of different methods. This isn't comprehensive of all of them. But what you see here is there are some trenchless HDD that can set up. That top one is would be up on shore. You can see the ocean or bay in the background. That would be able to install the export cable across the beach profile and then pop up offshore to then extend that further out to the wind farm. There is also trenching, plows and things like that that could be in the nearshore or in the offshore. There's in some instances there may be some dredging of a trench as well. And then if I mentioned earlier the scour protection, rock, concrete mats, depending on what the needs are and locations and the hydrodynamics. So in summary here, it's a combination of in-water work using a variety of different techniques, and it's really kind of customized to what the conditions are at each specific project site. There's going to need to be nearshore excavation and staging work in that shoreline zone, and then the importance of consideration of work window seasonality. So there may be a lot of activity in a shorter time period rather than year-round, depending on what those conditions are. So with that, back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you for covering that overview of all the technologies and infrastructure. There sure is a lot we should be thinking about. Next, we'll have Kathy Matthews from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to talk about the environmental permitting process for nearshore development and describe some of the main environmental considerations and concerns. Kathy Matthews is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Renewable Energy Coordinator for North Carolina. She has worked for the federal government for almost 3 decades at EPA as well as at the service. Her experience includes NEPA, endangered species, marine biology, wetlands, and water quality. Kathy, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pleased to be speaking to you today. I'd like to present a brief overview of the environmental considerations for coastal and onshore development. I'm going to start with a brief outline of the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA. All offshore wind projects are subject to the requirements of NEPA, as well as any associated onshore activities, and frankly, any activities that involve a federal action is subject to NEPA. You may have heard the terms environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, and those are the products of the NEPA process. Most federal agencies have developed their own NEPA guidance and procedures. Another act that was enacted in 2015 is the FAST-41 Act, and it provides a structure and procedures to improve the federal environmental review process for infrastructure projects. There's a FAST-41 dashboard on the internet, and it includes permitting timetables for the completion of the environmental reviews and authorization processes. FAST-41 covers 18 sectors of projects, including renewable energy production, electricity transmission, ports, and waterways. So I'm an employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Well, I skipped ahead a slide. And endangered and threatened species are one of the considerations that must be looked at during the NEPA process. And here's an unexhaustive list of other resources that need to be considered during the NEPA process. But today I'm going to be talking about the Endangered Species Act, which turned 50 this year. And the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect species threatened with extinction and the habitat upon which they depend. We share authority with the NOAA Fisheries Service. In general, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has authority over species on the land. And NOAA Fisheries has authority over species in the water. And that's a big generality because there are other exceptions to that. Endangered Species Act consultation is required under Section 7 for federal agencies when federal money is involved, or a federal permit, or if federal land such as a military installation or national park, something like that, is involved in the activity. They must consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries, or both, depending on the potential impacts. Endangered Species Act Section 10 outlines permitting procedures for private projects where there's no federal involvement. And it's important to note that Endangered Species Act compliance is required even if there's not a federal agency involved. For activities, infrastructure activities that we're talking about today, NOAA Fisheries should be coordinated with for in-water routes. That includes estuarine and nearshore and ocean activities and landfall. And any landfall and onshore activities should be coordinated with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is a really general list of species that may be affected by beach and nearshore activities. It's in no way exhaustive. The list varies depending on the area of the activity. So, of course, I don't think there's any area of the country where every single species on this list would be included, but this is an example. Estuarine resources, there's some very sensitive habitats in our estuaries and bays and sounds, including things such as shellfish nursery areas, areas for migrating and wintering waterfowl, and coastal marsh. For the inland alignment, depending on the area of the country, will likely have some kind of impact depending on the activities and the location, but typically, any kind of inland work is going to potentially impact habitat, cause habitat loss or degradation, such as ground disturbance, tree removal. There could be noise impacts or lighting impacts, things of that nature. So, and those need to be considered during Section 7 consultation as appropriate. Pretty much every environmental regulation requires some sort of avoidance and minimization to be considered for the project, and the location and alignment of the infrastructure is really the best opportunity to have avoidance and minimization. So if you can avoid a resource, that is of course going to be the best option, and it's not possible in every case, of course. So minimization is the second tier of that consideration, where if you can't avoid it, try to minimize the impact as much as possible. So here are some examples of different types of ways to avoid and minimize impacts, such as using existing right-of-ways for the cable routes, creating using disturbed areas for construction of new facilities, and restoring areas with native species if there are temporary impacts. So there are a lot of different BMPs that could be employed depending on the area location you are in and the type of activity you're doing. And all those must be considered during the NEPA process. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has an online tool for planning and consultation, or IPAC. It's a national project planning tool that streamlines our review process, and it provides a list of species and other resources. There are interactive tools on IPAC that can be used, such as determination keys, and there's also a consultation package builder that can be used depending on the project. We have a test beta site that can be used by anyone to go and kind of play around with the functionality of the site. And I would just recommend that if you do want to check out IPAC, start with the beta site. If you use the link at the top of the screen and create a project, that actually creates a project file on the internal system for the service. So if you don't want to create a project file, head for the beta site, and you can try all sorts of things, and it won't create a record. We also recommend at a minimum, especially for species impacts, to contact the State Natural Heritage Program. They typically hold the existing species data for your state. So if you go to IPAC and upload a shapefile or draw a polygon or a line to show where your project is, once you've created that project, it will provide a species list. And this is just a few of the pages that come up. In some areas of the country, you may get a list of migratory birds, facilities, federal facilities that may be in the area, and wetlands resources and things like that. So there's a lot of information that can be provided just by mapping your project in IPAC. So for more information on IPAC, I've got the website here. For Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species Act, you can navigate to your state's field office from the national website, and contact them for local questions. So, thanks for the opportunity to present today.
Of course, thanks, Kathy, for providing all that information. So for our last presentation, we have two people joining us from Aspen Environmental Group. Tatiana Inouye and Nagar Vahidi will be describing community effects for port-related development. Ms. Inouye is a land use and public policy specialist with Aspen Environmental Group. She has over 15 years experience preparing environmental documentation and compliance with CEQA, that's the California Environmental Quality Act, and NEPA. She has a particular focus on energy, water, and large-scale infrastructure projects. Ms. Vahidi specializes in the integration and completion of NEPA and CEQA, documentation, land use, and public policy analyses, as well as socioeconomics and environmental justice analysis. She has extensive experience managing and preparing a variety of federal, state of California, and local environmental planning and analytical documents for large-scale energy and water infrastructure. She currently serves as Aspen's Planning and Public Policy Director, focused on land use, socioeconomics, environmental justice, and public policy development and analysis. So welcome to you both, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Everything looks great.
Great. Okay, thank you. So Nagar and I will be speaking about community effects from activities at the ports. Now, when examining land use effects from port activities and development to support offshore wind, there are two types of effects to consider. First, impacts to physical land uses, and second, policy inconsistencies, which I will discuss a bit further. So as Shane described earlier in his presentation, port siting to support offshore wind would require large-scale infrastructure development. For example, to accommodate a staging and integration facility, new port expansion areas would need to be created, and this would require extensive amounts of fill. This type of port expansion, as well as other aspects of a new offshore wind industry, may interfere with current port operations, such as industrial or commercial port activities, recreational uses at the port, or depending on where the port is located, military or Coast Guard operations. The development and operation of a new offshore wind industry at an existing port may not be compatible with the surrounding community. Adjacent communities would be exposed to nuisance effects from turbine manufacturing and assembly at the ports and along major transportation routes, as also mentioned in Shane's presentation. My colleague Nagar will also talk more about these nuisance effects later. Other considerations are the siting of new transmission lines and supporting infrastructure, which may need to be located on lands designated for other uses, such as recreation, and which may diminish the value or character of that recreation area, may interfere with public access, particularly in coastal areas, and may ultimately contribute to a decline in coastal tourism uses. Another aspect of land use effects is the proximity of sensitive land uses within these surrounding communities. Sensitive land uses are defined as being particularly susceptible to the adverse nuisance effects of large-scale development, such as air emissions, noise, and traffic. Examples of sensitive land uses include residences, schools, daycare centers, and recreational facilities. A fourth consideration is the proximity of the port to coastal and marine areas that are protected. Areas that are of particular concern along the California coast include the National Marine Sanctuary, such as the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, as well as BLM's California Coastal National Monuments and numerous state parks and beaches. And the last item listed here to consider is the port's proximity to sensitive viewing locations, such as designated state scenic highways and scenic vistas. Expansion of ports for offshore wind activities could degrade the scenic quality of these coastal areas. Now, this is a graphic from a very high level opportunities and constraints analysis that Aspen prepared for an agency client in order to show the extent to which offshore wind turbines being assembled at ports would be visible from onshore areas, which is illustrated here in the purple shading. And also mentioned in Shane's presentation is that these floating offshore wind turbines that are being looked at along the West Coast are currently projected to be over 1,000 feet in height. A second type of land use effect from offshore wind development would be inconsistencies with existing policies and regulations that guide the development of ports in other coastal areas. Some states, such as California, have specific regulations that guide coastal development. For example, the California Coastal Act serves as the framework for local coastal planning by a harbor authority or by a coastal city or county jurisdiction. These coastal regulations are intended to accommodate multiple uses while providing for protection of coastal resources, such as biological, recreational, and visual resources, as well as preserving coastal access. Until existing plans and regulations are updated to address offshore wind development, port expansion activities to support offshore wind may be inconsistent with current planning regulations. In the California context, the process for updating coastal plans and regulations is extensive and requires coordination with numerous permitting agencies and affected stakeholders, which may include Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service, California Coastal Commission, State Lands Commission, harbor authorities, local jurisdictions, and other federal and state resource agencies. Consultation with Native American tribes is also a key component in any federal or state planning effort, and in California is subject to specific legislative requirements set forth in Assembly Bill 52 and Assembly Bill 525. Now I will pass it over to Nagar, who will discuss socioeconomic and environmental justice considerations. Nagar, I think you might be muted.
Hi, Nagar. It looks like you had hopped off, and Tatiana was just passing it back to you, so it's perfect
Yes,
timing.
sorry, it was giving me some messages that were not great. Thank you, Mark. And thanks, Tatiana. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Nagar. So these large port developments or port improvement projects can lead to both adverse and beneficial community effects. So as Shane mentioned, and you saw in the graphics, these large-scale port infrastructure projects are rather ominous and very large scale, right? So these can lead to short-term temporary construction-related and long-term permanent operation-related population growth if the construction and operation workers relocate into the project area, which would then increase the demand for temporary and permanent housing. For example, project workers may choose to move permanently into the area for construction employment opportunities on multiple projects. Or if they don't move into the area permanently, the temporary workers would need accommodations for the duration of construction, which may be lengthy depending on the activity. And as a result, the number of construction workers coming into the area for work may exceed the available capacity of short-term temporary housing. And these include rental units, hotels, motels, and campgrounds, depending on where the port is located. So what does this mean? It means an increase in demand for various things due to an influx of a new workforce coming into the area and the resulting effects on the surrounding community. Including, so you can have an increase in demand for permanent and temporary housing, potentially requiring local communities to plan for future housing to accommodate this incoming worker population. Or you can have an increase in demand in public services, including parks and recreation areas. Or you can have an increase in demand for extension of roads or infrastructure beyond the current forecast for an area. So the other factor to consider is that the labor skill requirements for both construction and operation may exceed the available skilled workers in the project area. And this would result in an increase in the workforce population, which would then lead to a change in the existing employment base, which can be beneficial. And there could also be beneficial effects in the form of tax revenue from local and state taxes like sales and property tax. These taxes can be generated through increased business transactions from construction and operation of the project facilities, as well as the land improvements for port upgrades, such as the addition or creation of new land at the port. So for example, one of the projects we're starting on is at Port of Long Beach, and that's the Pier Wind project. And that port development is going to require about 400 acres of fill to be added to the Port of Long Beach. So the next figure is, Tatiana, if you could go to the next slide for me. Thank you. So another important factor to consider as it relates to community effects is environmental justice issues, because the communities surrounding many of these established ports where these projects would be sited often consist of disadvantaged or vulnerable communities or populations. So the figure that you see, or the map you see on your screen, shows the ports of Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles. And the areas shown in purple show the disadvantaged communities. And these are two ports where we already know that some or all of the components that Shane described of these offshore wind development projects are proposed to happen, including staging and integration, manufacturing sites, and the operations and maintenance. And as you can see, these are all, the area is surrounded by disadvantaged communities. So Tatiana, next slide, please. So one of the first key tasks is to identify the surrounding populations and their existing levels of vulnerabilities and the legacy pollution that may have occurred in the area already. To then be able to determine the level of burden and disproportionate project effects that may be placed on these communities. As an example, affected populations surrounding a port could include high minority and low-income residents in the surrounding area, tribes as it relates to their cultural history and cultural resources of the area, or disadvantaged workers already in the area, such as those in the fishery workers community. So what types of effects can happen? A whole suite of effects can happen. And this is just a sampling. So first, the displacement of disadvantaged and vulnerable populations due to increased competition for housing and rising housing costs due to the influx of workers could occur. And increases in construction-related nuisance effects that Tatiana mentioned can affect the surrounding community's populations, such as construction-related traffic, noise, and air emissions at the port itself and along the onshore routes used for transport of materials, such as sediment for fill, turbine components, so on and so forth. Or the emissions from offshore marine transport vessels carrying project components, the same components for construction of the port to the port site. So the takeaway from all of this is that port-related community effects will obviously depend on the port's location. And there are a lot of other details and components to discuss and consider that we haven't gotten into today. But with that, I'll turn it over back to Mark, and maybe we can discuss some of this during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. It's a really important perspective to bring into this discussion. So as we move over to the panel discussion, I'd like to invite all the participants to enter any questions you may have in the chat, or if there's any topics you'd like the speakers to expand upon, please let us know. But with that, I can start with a few questions that I personally had. So one, let's just look at cable landfall to start. There's a lot of different approaches to landing the cable, as Shane described. And then in Kathy's presentation, you talked about using horizontal or directional drilling to avoid some onshore impacts. So maybe, Kathy, first to you, how does directional drilling minimize impact? And are there other methods that you've seen for cable designs?
Sure. Yeah. Directional drilling, I think, if, you know, other than aligning the cable in a completely different area, I think directional drilling is probably the second best option to avoid impacts. And we do, in most cases, consider avoidance depending on how it's done. But like Shane discussed in his presentation, you know, when you do directional drilling, you're actually going under the resource, and unless there's some kind of accident, you know, a release of drilling fluids or other things, there are no impacts typically to the resource that you're drilling under. So there still are things to consider, like you know, the location of where the drilling begins. There's typically like a box where you start your drill, and then when you pop out on the other side. So, but in general, being able to drill underneath really avoids the resource for the most part.
Great. And then maybe just a quick follow-up to Shane. Are there particular habitats or sediment structures where directional drilling is more likely to occur versus trenching, or is there really a wide array of criteria that go into making that decision?
Yeah, I'd say, you know, it's really site specific, and, you know, especially if we're talking about the open coastal shoreline, is really understanding what the variability of that beach is and the risks associated with, shoreline change and what the geometries are of where, the pit for the HDD is going to start on the shoreline. Where does it need to come out offshore? And so those geometries and then how much variability there could be in that shoreline profile and the minimum cover are really important considerations. So a really stable beach could be completely different than one that's, actively eroding or has huge changes seasonally. So it's really important that when the siting study is done, really have some good understanding not only of the habitat considerations, but also the coastal physical processes at the site.
Thanks, Shane. I'm starting to see several questions coming in the chat, and I'm going to make sure we get to some of the environmental justice questions as well. But first, I'm going to turn to a question from Cody Williams. How might some of these topics pertain to freshwater offshore wind energy in lakes? For example, with cable running, there's a concern of freshwater ice breaking through the insulation of cable as it crashes into the shore. So this might be a consideration for wind in the Great Lakes. Maybe I'll start with Kathy. Is there a different set of environmental regulations that would be relevant to freshwater development versus offshore marine development?
I don't think it's terribly different. And I'll just say I don't work for NOAA Fisheries, so they may have other things, other input on the offshore cable routing, but in the lakes, I mean, we would be concerned with the alignment and the habitat, the benthic habitat in the lake. For directional drilling, directional drilling is recommended in a lot of, and it's conducted in a lot of areas, including, inshore and on land. So, it would still be a good avoidance measure for the lakes.
Thanks. And now maybe turning a little bit to Aspen. I saw a couple questions come in, and I'm just gonna read off the first one. It was related to community benefits agreements. I can't find the question, but it was really about how can community benefits agreements be used? Have they been beneficial to local communities?
So I can answer that a little bit. So depending on, and we've seen community benefits programs for actually land-based wind generation, but depending on the avenue that a project developer uses to actually implement the project, the community benefits program is actually a requirement in some cases. So the state of California currently has an opt-in program where developers can opt into this, to develop their project under this process, and it can get streamlined as far as environmental review and permitting. And one of the components is a requirement for the applicant to show proof of an actual implementable community benefits program where they actually have signed agreements with the local affected community. So depending on where the port is located, it could be a whole litany of issues that can be mitigated. They can set up job training programs, promise creating a fire station, to serve the area. There's a whole litany of things you can include in those. And the state actually, under the opt-in program, would require you to show proof that you've coordinated with the stakeholders, you've addressed all of the issues related to the vulnerable communities and disadvantaged communities, and show that you have set agreements with them. So this is a whole huge topic right now, and I think it's going to get bigger and bigger, but it's a very good approach towards mitigation, including contracting the local workforce for doing the construction of a project.
Great. And maybe just following up on that, there was a question also about mitigation of social impacts. And this is something that I was thinking about as well when you were talking. If there's disadvantaged communities around the port and the development kind of has to happen in that port, what sorts of mechanisms are there for mitigating that?
So first and foremost, one of the most important things would be the very early and often engagement of the community in the project planning and in the alternatives development for the NEPA documents and CEQA documents. So that's the first component. And in addition to that, as with regard to impacts, you know, really the impacts are so widespread, you know, air quality, noise, visual impacts, depending on where you're located. And any of the mitigation related to those would obviously help mitigate the effects on the disadvantaged populations. But I think the key component right now is really, really early engagement by the lead agencies, whether they're, you know, a NEPA lead agency, a CEQA NEPA lead agency in California. There needs to be very early engagement and not just the typical engagement through your environmental review process, scoping meeting or public hearing on your draft. It needs to be, you know, pop-ups in the community, you know, engaging, you know, going to local agency council meetings or setting up specific, you know, meetings with community-based organizations very early on. It's actually beneficial to the project developer to do that, because then it will, you know, help streamline their process if they engage and get the support of the community, basically. So.
Fantastic. Thanks for that description. There were a couple questions I saw coming in around electromagnetic field effects from the cable. Rather than addressing that in detail here, since we don't really have the right structure of scientists on the panel, I'm going to point everyone to a research brief that we wrote with NREL as part of this project. I just put the link in the chat, and I know Haley had put it there earlier, but that link should not only just have our brief, but also have a whole set of peer-reviewed scientific literature describing that process. Sticking with subsea cables, I think this is probably a question more directed to Shane. So what have you seen for expected lifetime of some of these cables? And do you have any insight to the decommissioning process?
You know, these offshore wind farms are, you know, of course, on a lease with BOEM for the offshore component, and those may be in around the 25-year time horizon. So, you know, many of the infrastructure is being designed for that, you know, 25-year life, although they may be designed or, you know, could stay in place much longer than that. You know, if it's buried and depending on whether it's damaged during construction and things like that, there's some advantages, you know, with the technologies like HDD and to be able to provide, you know, quality assurances that's put through there and then covered. And so generally, they should be, you know, relatively lower maintenance if the installation is done correctly. Where there could be needs is, again, back to scour, or if something gets exposed, or if it gets an anchor catches it or something like that, that would be some needs for, you know, repairs and things like that. And then, yeah, decommissioning would be part of the lease agreement and permitting requirements on how to pull that infrastructure back out.
Great, and I know BOEM does have requirements for decommissioned equipment, so that's great reference. I saw one question that had quite a few thumbs up, and it was relating to green hydrogen. So I'm going to quickly skim, find that one, and then see if we have any comments related to it. With new development in wind, is the incorporation of green hydrogen, what impacts do you foresee with this that may not be typically considered with renewable development? So I think first we would need to understand what additional infrastructure would be proposed there with green hydrogen, and then think through the environmental impacts. I'm not sure if anyone on this panel has any experience with that, but just want to open the floor if you do. All right, well, maybe it is an area for future thought and maybe something we can think through as a project as well. I think we have time for a brief final question. And there were a few comments relating to what are nearshore effects of potential changes in upwelling patterns or oceanographic patterns associated with offshore wind or adjacent development. I'm also not sure that we have the right panelists to discuss this, because I know there's work being done by modelers and scientists in that area. But maybe quickly to Kathy, where would, if at all, changes to upwelling be considered in the environmental review process that you're aware of?
Changes to upwelling, and again, I work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and not NOAA Fisheries, so I'm speaking mainly on for Fish and Wildlife Service resources, which concerns marine birds that are typically found using these areas of upwelling for foraging. And so that would be a concern of ours. I imagine that NOAA Fisheries would probably also be a little bit concerned, because you may have important fishery resources in those areas also. But we typically look at those areas as areas where we want to look really closely at the marine bird species that are present there and might be either loafing, on the water, sitting on the water there and taking off, for potential collision risk, or also we'd also be looking at potential for the wind facility to also change that upwelling and affect the availability of the foraging habitat for those birds.
Thanks, Kathy. That's great perspective. As we wrap up, I know we weren't able to get to all the questions. I apologize for that, but feel free to contact any of us, or at least me, and I'll try to help or point you in the right direction. As part of our wrap up, I have a few notes. So we will post a recording and the presentation slides online. They'll be available through the TETHIS webpage, which is shown here. But fortunately, you won't have to search too far, because you'll probably have an email in the next day or two for everyone that registered that will say, here's the recording, here's the link to help you out there. And I guess with that, I would just like to thank first and foremost the audience members for attending and listening to us this morning or this afternoon, wherever you're located. And of course, to our wonderful speakers who helped make this happen. So with that, I'll be happy to close it down and look forward to any additional follow-up after.